So Queen Camilla is reportedly sitting there, watching a $15 million tiara get abruptly pulled from a high-stakes auction listing, and the scandalous story about exactly how it got there is about to violently collide with a highly sensitive letter that Queen Elizabeth wrote shortly before she died. That explosive letter, basically named Princess Anne, means the real, underlying question isn't simply whether the tiara was inappropriately listed for sale. The real, terrifying question is exactly why nobody in the palace establishment checked where the rest of the priceless jewels went until it was almost entirely too late to recover them. And when you sit down and actually look closely at exactly what the palace officially said versus what definitively happened behind closed doors, the whole official narrative falls apart significantly faster than a house of cards in a wind tunnel. Before we dive deep into this unprecedented situation, if you want the full, unfiltered breakdown on royal drama exactly as it unfolds in real time, hit Elizabeth's vast personal collection suddenly showed up prominently in a private, highly exclusive auction listing, surprisingly categorized under anonymous ownership. There was absolutely no public announcement, no formal process, exhaustive legal review, and meticulous documentation before changing hands. There is a rigid, unbreakable paper trail for absolutely everything that leaves the royal vaults. Except here, alarmingly, there wasn't one. Princess Anne eventually found out about the listing through the highly specific, incredibly quiet whisper network that exists strictly inside elite royal circles. A master jeweler who instantly recognized the historic piece casually mentioned it to someone who intimately knew the royal inventory. That person then discreetly told someone who had worked incredibly closely with Queen Elizabeth in her final vulnerable years, and suddenly Anne was aggressively making phone calls. And she was absolutely not calling the useless palace press office for spin. She was calling the specific people she deeply trusted, former royal protection officers, fiercely loyal staff members who had served her mother personally for decades. And exactly what she started to quickly uncover through these back channels made the unauthorized sale of a $15 million tiara look exactly like the absolute least of her looming problems. Because it quickly turned out that other highly significant pieces had been mysteriously disappearing too. An exquisite Victorian diamond brooch, a priceless sapphire necklace that Queen Elizabeth had famously worn at glittering state banquets across 3 decades, a heavy emerald choker with a documented provenance stretching all the way back through multiple historic reigns. Each one of these priceless artifacts had been quietly, casually noted as absent during routine vault checks over the years, and each time, the deeply concerning matter had been inexplicably allowed to rest entirely without any formal resolution or investigation. Which is essentially a very polite, bureaucratic way of saying that someone highly placed had deliberately made the uncomfortable questions simply go away. That's exactly where this situation gets genuinely weird and incredibly sinister. If these disappearances were truly just simple, innocent administrative oversights by overworked staff, exactly why were the disappearances methodically spread out over such a remarkably long period of time? Why were the priceless items being covertly routed through anonymous high-end auction houses scattered across Europe, and in at least 2 highly suspicious cases deep into the Middle East? That is absolutely not a disorganized oversight. That is a clear, deliberate pattern. And highly lucrative patterns like that absolutely do not happen by accident in heavily guarded palaces. Now, here's exactly where the story takes a sharp turn that I genuinely did not see coming. Anne's trusted people started aggressively cross-referencing the list of missing items against recent, high-end global auction results. The visual matches were absolutely never perfect, having been deliberately, carefully obscured through layers of shady intermediaries and shell companies, but they were undeniably close enough that expert, world-renowned jewelers were quietly, secretly shown high-resolution photographs and asked for their professional, binding opinions. The confirmations eventually came back to Anne, incredibly careful in their legal language, but absolutely unambiguous in their ultimate meaning. These were undeniably the exact same missing pieces. And then, a brave member of the royal household staff finally came forward in strict, terrified confidence and described something that completely changed the entire, terrifying shape of Anne's investigation. They described highly unusual late-night movements within the residences, heavy packages being carefully, quietly wrapped by staff, then being covertly transported directly from Clarence House to Raymill House in Wiltshire in the dead of night. There was absolutely no formal security logging of these movements and zero official documentation justifying the transfers. Staff members who dared to ask questions about the strange activity were explicitly told, in that highly particular icy tone that makes it abundantly clear that any further inquiry would be incredibly unwise for their careers, that the matter absolutely did not concern them. Raymill House is Queen Camilla's highly secluded private country estate. Crucially, it sits entirely outside the long reach of official royal records, institutional security cameras, and palace oversight. And according to the exact same terrified source, absolutely not everything that was moved had been sold off at auction. Some of the most significant pieces were reportedly still there, being held securely in a private hidden vault, deliberately and illegally hidden from the crown. That is absolutely not a simple, forgivable misunderstanding. That is absolutely not a sloppy administrative error by a junior clerk. That represents a highly coordinated, deliberate effort to actively move historically significant, priceless jewelry entirely out of official, protected state custody and directly into private, untraceable hands. And the undeniable fact that it happened so gradually, over a long period that stretched back much, much further than anyone initially assumed, strongly suggests this wasn't an impulsive, opportunistic crime. It was highly organized and systemic. But Princess Anne was still missing one crucial thing, the definitive proof that would instantly transform her investigation from merely compelling to absolutely undeniable in the eyes of the king. And it incredibly turned out that her late mother had specifically, brilliantly, left it exactly for her to find. Months after the state funeral, during a highly emotional, rather as a firm boundary drawn with deliberate, undeniable care, she explicitly asked that Camilla strictly respect the vital distinction between exactly what belonged to the crown, exactly what belonged to the wider family, and exactly what had been Elizabeth's alone to give away. The language used was highly measured and polite, but the underlying meaning was absolutely not open to interpretation. So, Anne sat there alone with the slit letter resting in her hands, and suddenly, absolutely everything about the crisis changed. Before discovering the letter, she had been operating purely on gathered evidence and deep personal loyalty. She had essentially been a grieving daughter acting on raw instinct. Someone determined to casually dismiss her concerns could still easily frame her as a grieving, irrational woman completely overwhelmed by loss, allowing her raw emotion to distort her judgment and create wild conspiracy theories. That specific, condescending framing had already been attempted quietly by those courtiers closest to Camilla. But the letter violently removed every single line of that defensive argument in a single, decisive stroke. Anne was absolutely no longer just acting on her own grief or suspicion. She was now acting on the explicit, heavily documented, personally expressed legal instruction of the late Queen herself. And there is absolutely no argument, not within a fractured family, not within a complex institution, and certainly not within a rigid monarchy built entirely on the foundational principle that the sovereign's word carries permanent, unchallengeable weight, that survives direct contact with that kind of evidence. But long before Anne could officially make her move, Camilla had already actively begun her own defensive maneuvers, and she chose her battlefield with considerable, calculating care. Camilla had absolutely not survived decades of intense public hostility and brutal institutional resistance by being weak or passive in moments of crisis. She understood power intimately, not in its loud, aggressive, confrontational form, but in its significantly quieter and far more durable, insidious expression. She mastered the careful, deliberate placement of a specific word, the highly strategic framing of a public narrative, and the uncanny ability to ensure that the specific version of events most favorable to her own precarious position was always the one that reached the right, influential ears first. She reached Charles long before Anne did, and exactly what she did was incredibly, deviously clever. She didn't deny the explosive accusations outright. That would have foolishly required engaging directly with hard evidence she couldn't yet fully assess or see. Instead, she brilliantly reframed the entire situation. She gently, seemingly out of deep concern, suggested to Charles that Anne was simply not well, absolutely not physically ill, but emotionally unstable. She posited that the profound loss of Elizabeth had hit Anne with a devastating force that those around her were only just beginning to truly understand. Her grief, profound and genuine as it undeniably was, had tragically begun to express itself in erratic ways that were causing deep concern for her mental state. The aggressive inquiries she was making, the former staff people she was frantically contacting, the wild conclusions she appeared to be hastily drawing, Camilla suggested these were absolutely not the rational actions of someone thinking clearly. They were merely the desperate actions of a devoted, heartbroken daughter who had absolutely not yet found her way through an extraordinary, paralyzing loss. That is a portrait designed with absolute psychological precision, and it was delivered directly to the one person whose ultimate response to it would definitively determine absolutely everything that followed. Charles simply listened. He completely failed to dispute what Camilla said about his sister. He didn't defend Anne's sanity or loyalty with the absolute directness the dire situation desperately required. Instead, he stubbornly occupied the exact position that those who had watched him navigate decades of intense family tension had come to painfully recognize as his absolute most familiar one. He remained suspended agonizingly between competing loyalties, looking visibly, physically pained by the sheer impossibility of the choice before him, and ultimately, predictably moving slowly toward the one option that required the absolute least amount of immediate confrontation. He weakly asked for time. He softly suggested the sensitive matter be handled incredibly quietly behind closed doors. He expressed the vague hope in the careful, non-committal language of someone who intimately understands that hope is absolutely not a viable strategy but sometimes has absolutely nothing better to offer a crisis, that things might somehow magically resolve themselves without requiring any further, messy escalation. They would absolutely not resolve themselves, but his painful hesitation successfully bought Camilla something incredibly valuable: space. Within that critical space, the massive institutional machinery had already begun its own careful, relentless movements. Senior advisors and powerful private secretaries, whose ultimate unyielding loyalty was entirely to the smooth functioning of the monarchy rather than to absolutely any individual within it, had become acutely aware that a highly dangerous situation was developing. They knew that if it reached the press in an uncontrolled explosive form, it could produce devastating consequences that absolutely no palace statement, however brilliantly worded, would be sufficient to contain. A formal, exhaustive review of certain key inventory records was quietly, urgently initiated. Staff members who had previously been aggressively instructed to treat specific matters as permanently closed were now being approached again by investigators. Gently, without overt pressure, but with a chilling clarity of purpose that made the serious nature of the inquiry completely unmistakable. The machinery had begun moving. The lingering question was whether it was moving toward uncovering the truth or simply moving rapidly to ensure that whatever ugly truth existed could be thoroughly managed and buried before it became something the institution could absolutely no longer shape. But while the terrified palace calculated its next move, the massive cache of evidence Anne had meticulously assembled was already beginning to find its way far beyond the thick walls that were desperately meant to contain it. The very first undeniable sign that the story had completely outgrown the palace's ability to contain it came absolutely not from a tabloid journalist, not from a formal, coordinated leak, and absolutely not from anyone who had been part of Anne's trusted circle of inquiry. It came directly from the insular world of specialist, high-end jewelers, a community significantly smaller and far more interconnected than most people realize, where the specific provenance of a highly significant piece moves through professional networks with a blinding speed and precision that absolutely no institutional silence can easily outpace or suppress. The single damning photograph of the tiara had been circulating quietly among industry experts for several tense days before absolutely anyone outside that specific world became aware of its existence. It showed the priceless tiara, unmistakable to absolutely anyone with the relevant historical knowledge, in a degraded condition and cheap context that made its sudden appearance in a private auction listing absolutely not merely surprising, but deeply, screamingly anomalous. The piece was well known, its history was extensively documented, its last formal connection to the royal collection was a matter of public record, and its sudden presence in circumstances heavily suggesting an illicit private sale was, to those who truly understood exactly what they were looking at, a massive, glaring question that violently demanded an immediate answer. That specific question reached an investigative journalist within 48 hours. Once it did, the entire arithmetic of the situation changed completely. A massive story that had previously existed entirely within the sealed, controlled environment of palace walls and trusted private circles was now firmly in the hands of someone whose exact profession strictly required them to relentlessly pursue it, and who already possessed enough preliminary, explosive information to know that pursuing it would be career-making. The first published references were incredibly careful, framed as questions rather than direct accusations, heavily citing unnamed, terrified sources and unconfirmed swirling reports. But, in the architecture of a rapidly developing media story, careful early framing almost rarely survives contact with exactly what comes next. The immediate public reaction was visceral and explosive in a way that caught even the most seasoned royal correspondents completely off guard. The tiara was instantly recognized by the public. Archival, iconic photographs of Elizabeth wearing it at a glittering silver Jubilee engagement, at a highly publicized state visit in the 1980s, and at a massive Commonwealth gathering that had been broadcast to millions, began circulating wildly across social media within mere hours of the first vague reports appearing online. What followed was absolutely not merely dry political commentary or standard institutional criticism. It was something significantly more personal and in many ways far more powerful than either. People who had grown up fondly watching Elizabeth proudly wear these exact pieces experienced their potential, illicit loss absolutely not as a boring constitutional issue, but as a deeply personal theft of shared memory. These were absolutely not abstract objects belonging to an abstract, wealthy institution. They were a vital part of the visual language of a historic reign that had spanned the lifetimes of multiple generations. The panicked palace said absolutely nothing. There was no firm denial issued, no helpful clarification offered, no acknowledgement that absolutely any question had been raised at all. In the long, storied history of royal crisis management, complete silence has occasionally served its purpose to kill a story. But this was absolutely not one of those occasions. The deafening silence read to the furious public exactly as a confirmation of guilt. To the ravenous press, it read exactly as an open invitation to keep digging aggressively. And then, a devastating detail emerged that violently shifted the entire emotional register of the story. Among the priceless pieces now being openly discussed in connection with the reported disappearances was Princess Diana's pearl bracelet. This was a deeply personal, highly significant possession, a wedding gift directly from the Spencer family, carrying an immense weight of public feeling that instantly placed it in an entirely different, infinitely more explosive category from absolutely every other item on the missing list. The exact moment Diana's name entered the story, it completely ceased to be a mere scandal about stolen jewelry. It instantly became something the British public understood instinctively, in their very bones, as a matter of profound betrayal. From across the Atlantic, Prince Harry had gone very, uncharacteristically quiet. Those who intimately knew him instantly recognized that particular, heavy quality of silence. A massive decision was actively being weighed, but one final, absolutely unavoidable meeting still remained to happen in London, and both women had deeply known from the exact moment the letter was found that it was coming. Princess Anne chose Clarence House incredibly deliberately for the showdown. Not Balmoral, which carried entirely too much of Elizabeth's lingering presence to allow either woman to think clearly. not Windsor, which was entirely too formal, too institutional, and too easily interpreted by staff as an escalation into official state territory. Clarence House was Camilla's personal space, and Anne had explicitly chosen it for precisely that reason. She wanted Camilla to feel she was on familiar, safe ground when the damning dossier was finally placed in front of her. She wanted there to be absolutely no argument afterward that the brutal confrontation had been unfairly staged in a way specifically designed to disadvantage or intimidate the Queen Consort. Everything about Anne's methodical approach had been constructed to be absolutely unimpeachable. The hard evidence would speak, the authenticated letter would speak, and Anne herself would speak absolutely only as much as was strictly necessary to end it. She arrived at the residence entirely without announcement, entirely without ceremony, and entirely without the kind of massive entourage that loudly signals a desire to perform a spectacle rather than to resolve a crisis. She carried only a single heavy folder. Inside it were high-resolution photographs of the missing pieces meticulously cross-referenced against archival records, detailed shipping logs that flawlessly corroborated the terrified testimony of the household staff member who had described the illicit late-night movements between Clarence House and Raymill House, and undeniable records from auction houses in Europe showing anonymous consignments bearing descriptions that matched with an incredibly uncomfortable degree of precision pieces last formally documented in Elizabeth's personal inventory. And resting at the absolute center of the folder, in its sealed envelope now sliced open, its contents completely unmistakable, was Elizabeth's handwritten letter. The room they met in was a private, intimate sitting room, small enough that the physical distance between them was completely impossible to mistake for anything other than exactly what it was. Anne absolutely did not raise her voice once. She absolutely never did in moments that truly mattered. She deliberately placed the folder squarely on the table between them and began to speak in the exact manner that those who had witnessed her under intense pressure consistently described: highly measured, incredibly sequential, and completely without retreat. She methodically presented each devastating piece of evidence in the exact order that built the clearest possible, undeniable picture of theft. She did absolutely not editorialize the facts. She did absolutely not accuse in emotional language that could easily be disputed or debated. She simply allowed the documents, the photographs, and the sworn testimonies to carry the massive weight that she had spent weeks painstakingly assembling them to carry. Camilla simply listened, her composure impressively held, but those present acutely noted its fragile quality. It was the rigid composure of someone working incredibly hard to maintain a calm surface, rather than the relaxed composure of someone who genuinely has nothing to fear. She absolutely did not interrupt Anne. She did absolutely not immediately deny the allegations. When Anne finally finished her presentation, Camilla responded in the exact way that had successfully served her throughout decades of navigating impossible, hostile situations. She subtly introduced doubt at the very margins of the story. She had spoken with Elizabeth about it directly. Elizabeth had graciously received it into her personal keeping with an explicit, shared understanding of exactly what it represented and exactly where it was permanently meant to remain. The implication required absolutely no further elaboration from commentators. The bracelet had absolutely not been simply lost. It had absolutely not been simply lost. It had absolutely not been simply lost in the chaotic administrative upheaval that inevitably follows any significant royal death. According to Diana's own authenticated words, its intended, final destination had been made perfectly clear to everyone involved. And exactly what had reportedly happened to it afterwards stood in direct, devastating contradiction to absolutely everything Diana had desperately asked for and Elizabeth had explicitly agreed to honor. The unauthorized release detonated across international media within mere hours. Absolutely every major global outlet ran the explosive story alongside archival photographs showing Diana proudly wearing the bracelet at glittering engagements across the 1980s and 90s. Its unique design was instantly familiar to absolutely anyone who had followed her highly public life with absolutely any degree of attention. The devastating combination of Harry's disclosure and the undeniable visual archive of Diana wearing the specific piece transformed the entire story completely. It was absolutely no longer a dry royal family dispute about inventory management, missing spreadsheets, or boring institutional procedure. It was a massive, emotional story about Diana, and stories explicitly about Diana carry a terrifying weight within the global public imagination that almost absolutely nothing else in the modern history of the British monarchy can ever hope to match. The public reaction was global, immediate, and absolutely overwhelming in its raw emotional intensity. Highly respected commentators who had previously approached the missing jewels story with measured, careful caution now spoke incredibly plainly and aggressively. Leading experts on royal protocol, renowned constitutional historians, and former highly placed palace insiders, people who intimately understood exactly what they were risking by speaking publicly against the crown, began actively giving explosive television interviews that would have been completely unthinkable a week earlier. The specific auction house that had been directly connected to the tiara listing officially confirmed, entirely without being asked twice, that the controversial piece had been voluntarily, permanently withdrawn pending a massive, full internal review of its provenance documentation. That single, panicked confirmation told the ravenous press absolutely everything the palace's deafening silence had stubbornly refused to. Inside the palace, the atmosphere had rapidly moved far beyond mere tension into something significantly closer to a controlled collapse. Senior advisors who had fruitlessly spent weeks desperately attempting to manage the situation from within now faced the terrifying reality that management was absolutely no longer possible. The story possessed a massive momentum entirely its own. And somewhere completely trapped at the center of it, Camilla's carefully maintained composure was being violently tested in a way that absolutely no amount of PR preparation could have fully anticipated. Balmoral Castle was undeniably the absolute only place left on Earth where anything could possibly be resolved. And Balmoral had absolutely always been Elizabeth's place, which was precisely why Anne had been patiently waiting for them to arrive there. Balmoral absolutely does not feel like a place where political power is loudly exercised. That is precisely what makes it so incredibly effective as a setting for those rare moments when ultimate power is finally being forced to account for itself. The sprawling estate carries a unique quality of profound stillness that has absolutely nothing to do with quiet and absolutely everything to do with permanence. It radiates the deep sense that the ground itself has absorbed enough massive history to render ordinary, petty human calculations temporarily beside the point. Elizabeth had understood this intuitively and instinctively, which was exactly why she had returned there every single year entirely without exception, and exactly why those who had known her best deeply understood that Anne choosing Balmoral for exactly what was about to happen was absolutely not a logistical decision. It was a massive, undeniable statement. Anne arrived first. Those who closely observed her movement through the sprawling estate that morning described it in terms that were entirely consistent across absolutely every account. Highly unhurried, absolutely certain, and completely without the desperate quality of performance that tends to accompany people who are hyper-aware of being watched at significant moments. She intimately knew absolutely every corridor, absolutely every room, absolutely every particular quality of light at different hours of the day. She had been coming here since her early childhood. Balmoral was absolutely not neutral ground for her. It was undeniably her mother's ground, and she moved through it fiercely accordingly. Charles arrived looking exactly like a man who had absolutely not slept well in several exhausting weeks, which, by absolutely every available account, was an entirely accurate reflection of his deteriorating physical and mental condition. The immense, crushing weight of what had developed, the agonizingly competing loyalties, the suffocating institutional pressure, the massive public story that had now grown exponentially far beyond absolutely anything that private conversation could contain, was incredibly visible in a way that those accustomed to his usual flawless public composure found quietly striking and deeply alarming. He greeted Anne with the particular, highly careful warmth of someone who desperately understands that warmth alone is absolutely no longer sufficient, but has absolutely not yet determined what specific action would be. Camilla arrived last. She was immaculately composed. The polished surface held flawlessly, as it almost absolutely always did, but those who watched her incredibly closely in the tense minutes right before the gathering began noted tiny, revealing details that told an entirely different story, vibrating beneath the composure. She nervously adjusted her expensive watch twice in the space of a mere quarter of an hour. A very small gesture, undeniably, but one that those who had spent years observing her in highly tense, high-pressure situations instantly recognized as the single, reliable signal that her internal equilibrium was currently under massive strain. It proved that her flawless external presentation was working incredibly hard to conceal panic. The private chamber where the fractured family assembled was a specific room that Elizabeth had frequently used for highly personal correspondence and quiet, undisturbed reflection. It was absolutely not a formal, intimidating meeting room, absolutely not a space specifically designed for dry institutional proceedings, but rather somewhere that carried the unmistakable heavy imprint of the woman whose profound absence was the exact reason absolutely everyone had gathered. Anne had chosen it incredibly deliberately. Absolutely every single choice she had made throughout this entire, grueling process had been highly deliberate and calculated. She calmly placed the massive dossier on the table. She gently placed the handwritten letter directly beside it, and she presented her devastating case with the exact same measured, sequential precision she had ruthlessly brought to Clarence House. Except that this time, Charles was sitting in the room. This time, the massive institutional weight of exactly what the letter represented could absolutely not be cleverly reframed as a petty private grievance or casually dismissed as grief severely misshaping a daughter's judgment. Elizabeth's own handwriting sat plainly on the table directly in front of absolutely everyone present, and it required absolutely nothing from Anne beyond the simple, powerful act of having placed it there. What intensely followed lasted several grueling hours. Camilla desperately deflected, skillfully reframed, and aggressively questioned the interpretation of certain key evidence with a stubborn persistence that those present would later describe as truly remarkable in its consistency, even as the mountain of evidence against her continued to accumulate on the table. But hard evidence, when properly assembled and presented completely without emotional excess, possesses a relentless quality that sustained, desperate deflection eventually cannot match. The truth absolutely does not tire, it absolutely does not become uncertain, it simply remains. When the heavy silence finally came to the room, it was the profound silence of something massive having finally been settled. No formal announcement was made to the press. Absolutely no statement was prepared for release. But in the quiet days that followed, certain undeniable things happened that communicated the outcome significantly more clearly than any words ever could have. The explosive tiara listing was formally, permanently withdrawn. A massive, comprehensive inventory review was officially initiated through proper, rigorous institutional channels, and at a highly publicized public engagement shortly afterward, Anne stood directly beside Charles in a position and with an expression that those who had spent decades watching her instantly recognized as the look of someone who has successfully finished exactly what they came to do. The priceless jewels finally returning to their secure vaults was absolutely only a small part of what had fundamentally changed at Balmoral. The rest of exactly what had changed would take much longer to become fully visible to the public, and some of it absolutely never would. The Victorian diamond brooch safely came back first, then the sapphire necklace, then the heavy emerald choker, and finally, handled with a very particular reverent care that those present in the vault that day described as something significantly closer to a sacred ceremony than standard procedure, Diana's pearl bracelet. Each highly significant piece was photographed, meticulously catalogued, and formally, legally documented in the exact manner that absolutely should have strictly governed its custody from the very beginning. Expert conservators who examined them confirmed with relief that they were entirely undamaged, their physical integrity fully intact. Exactly what had been done to their history, however, was another matter entirely, and absolutely not something that any amount of careful documentation could ever fully repair. Anne absolutely did not attend the formal inventory process. She had done exactly what she came to do, and she had absolutely no interest in the empty institutional theater of its conclusion. Within days of the tense Balmoral gathering, she had smoothly returned to her grueling schedule, engagements, visits, and duties with the exact same unbroken regularity that had defined her entire public life across 5 decades. Those around her noted that she absolutely did not speak about exactly what had happened, even in private. This was absolutely not because she was concealing anything, but because for Anne, a matter concluded is simply a matter concluded. Elizabeth had asked something incredibly difficult of her. She had flawlessly delivered it. The conversation, and her fundamental understanding of things, was over. For Camilla, absolutely nothing was quite over. She retained her high position. She continued to appear regularly at Charles's side at highly visible public engagements, remaining composed and correctly dressed, successfully fulfilling absolutely every visible requirement of the immense role she occupied. But the specific quality of the space around her had fundamentally changed in ways that were incredibly subtle enough to be completely deniable, yet completely unmistakable enough to be deeply felt by absolutely everyone paying attention. Former allies who had previously defended her with genuine warmth now defended her using the highly particular, incredibly careful language of people who were actively thinking about their own proximity to a massive story they absolutely no longer wished to be associated with. Certain key relationships within the wider family carried a significantly colder temperature than they had before. She was still undeniably queen consort, but she inhabited that massive title in a room that had been permanently, subtly rearranged around her, and absolutely everyone in it knew it. Charles carried his own highly particular, heavy version of the painful aftermath. The massive question that the entire exhausting saga had quietly deposited right at the very center of his historical legacy was one that absolutely no official statement could ever dissolve, and absolutely no passage of time would ever fully neutralize. How much had he actually known, and exactly how much had he actively chosen not to see? His paralyzing hesitation during the absolute most critical weeks of the confrontation, his desperate retreat into the empty language of hope and time, rather than employing the strong language of decision, would be interpreted entirely differently by different observers for many years to come. He had complete access to absolutely everything Anne had discovered. He had actively chosen absolutely not to act until the institution violently forced the issue. Whether that failure was born of blind loyalty, severe conflict avoidance, or a form of deliberate, cowardly inaction that constitutes its own kind of choice, that massive question would remain permanently open. It absolutely always would. What the monarchy itself ultimately took from the dark episode was a harsh lesson of a kind that massive institutions absorb incredibly slowly and record absolutely nowhere officially, but carry heavily forward nonetheless. That profound history can easily be stolen absolutely not by outsiders, but by the very people entrusted to fiercely protect it, and that the absolute greatest treasures in absolutely any collection depend entirely not on the quality of their locks, but squarely on the unshakable integrity of those who hold the keys. The priceless jewels were finally safe, the long, historic reign they had witnessed was over, and the brilliant woman who had spent 70 long years ensuring the crown would successfully outlast her had, in the very end, placed her ultimate trust in exactly the right person. Princess Anne didn't need a sparkling tiara to prove her loyalty. She just needed a handwritten letter, a heavy fold